Hi everyone, welcome to the Ask Dr. Lin show where I answer questions that hit BAKERpedia.com daily. Every day, thousands of bakers come to our website to view our information. Some of them leave questions, and this is where I take the opportunity to answer them. I am Dr. Lin from BAKERpedia, the world's largest resource for technical baking information, and the only place you should go first when you need your technical questions answered on the go. What I usually do on this show is to answer the questions that concerns commercial bakers. Yes, you know when you go up over 30 pounds of water in your dough all of a sudden, just as you switch from silo 1 to silo 2 and everything looks the same on the COAs, who has the time to do an hour-long research on the internet to determine what's wrong? Well, this is what this show is for. Place any comments on the topics that you are researching on BAKERpedia, and I'll do my best to answer them on the show. Alright, I'm going to focus today's show on flour and dough questions. Today's episode is sponsored by the Wheat Marketing Center. Do you have flour samples to analyze? Do you have questions about your flour quality? Well, turn to the Wheat Marketing Center testing labs. Check them out at wmcinc.org. In this episode, Dr. Jayne Bock and I discuss flour treatments and answer few questions during our live stream at the Wheat Marketing Center. Enjoy!
Thanks, Lynn. So let's go ahead and get started here. And just to give you a brief rundown of how we've structured this webinar today, we're going to spend about 5 minutes on flour treatments, another 10 minutes on flour specifications, and then we'll wrap it up with about 15 minutes or so of analytical techniques that are likely to show up or that you can request in those specifications. So let's go ahead and get started with the flour treatments. Here. All right, so what are flour treatments? Basically, all flour treatments are chemicals or additives that we're using to enhance the natural aging process and improve flour and juice quality. So we're talking about things like bleaching, maturing flour, maybe malting, and also things like enrichment as well. So let's kind of dive down into these in a little bit more detail. So let's start with bleaching. It's probably one of the most common flour treatments that you're likely to encounter. And all it is the process of removing yellow pigments from your flour. Wheat naturally contains carotenoids that give a yellow color to the flour, and in a lot of products and in a lot of countries, that's not really desirable. So we use a bleaching process to remove or mute those yellow pigments. So you get a whiter, brighter flour. You should remember, though, that any brand specs are not going to be bleached. So if you have a lot of brand contamination in your flour, that still shows up as brown specks. We typically use a peroxide, something like benzoyl peroxide. We'll do this for both hard and soft wheat flours to improve the color. There's really no effect on baking performance, but it will say on the label that it's a bleached flour. So it's something that will be called out on the label. Now, if we move on to the flour treatment maturing, basically all this is the process of speeding up the aging of flour. So normally maturing would take place over time. Oxygen would interact with the flour, and you get this maturation process that slowly changes the properties of the flour. We don't really have 6 months to wait for that to happen. So a lot of times we'll use an additive to speed up that process and do the exact same thing the oxygen would be doing naturally to the flour over time. We typically only use this for hard wheat flour because it'll strengthen the dough forming properties in the flour. And through that, you'll improve gas retention and you'll tend to increase the volume of the products as well. So the types of additives that we would use for that would be things like potassium bromate and potassium iodate. Neither of those is really very popular most places. So you're not very likely to encounter those. Azodicarbonamide or ADA is another option, although it's kind of fallen out of favor with consumers, so you don't tend to see it as much as you used to. Probably the most popular right now would be ascorbic acid. And that's what you're most likely to encounter to help with that maturing or aging process and strengthening of the flour. So we also have a flour treatment called malting that we employ, and it's basically adding amylase, which is an enzyme to flour. This enzyme converts starch into sugars. That's all it's doing. It's a natural enzyme. It's breaking down the starch. It can be added directly as an enzyme to the flour, so you're adding the purified enzyme, or you can add an ingredient like malted barley flour that naturally has produced amylase to the flour to get the enzyme in there. It will improve baking performance and consistency across a range of products. So with bread, it'll help improve loaf volume. Cakes, it'll help with volume and crumb structure. And in things like cookies, it'll improve spread and the spread ratio. So it has an impact across a wide range of products. So the last flour treatment we'll talk about is enrichment. As we mill the flour and remove the bran, we are removing some nutrients and vitamins and minerals with the bran. And so all the enrichment is the process of adding those nutrients back to the flour to replace what we lost with the bran during milling. It has no impact on baking performance. Sometimes, depending on the form of iron, there might be a slight effect, but by and large, the impact will be very, very minimal, if any, on baking performance.
So the first question I have is, Dr. Jayne, why do we need to enrich flour?
So as I mentioned earlier in the webinar, we remove a lot of minerals and vitamins in the milling process when we remove the bran. And so back in the 30s, during the Depression, these were nutrients of concern for the American population as a whole. So at least within the US, we are legally required to enrich the flour and add those vitamins and minerals back to bring it back to what would have been the nutrient content of the wheat as a whole.
I have questions that come into BAKERpedia that asks if it is still necessary to enrich flour today. What's your opinion on that?
That's a really good question. So back during the Great Depression, when people were struggling to put food on the table and bread was still a staple, it was absolutely necessary to enrich the flour. Today, with the better diet that we have and the better access to vitamins and minerals, it's maybe not absolutely essential, but we've been doing it for so long now that it's something that would be really difficult to stop doing. Breads and cereals are still staples for a lot of families. Mm-hmm. The other thing to keep in mind is that we also started adding folic acid to a lot of these grain-based products, which are important for small children and pregnant women to prevent neural tube defects. So that is also another nutrient of concern in very specific populations. And so that's one of the best ways of administering it.
So yes, we still need to.
Yeah.
Right. Can anyone in the US get flour that's not enriched?
That would be really tough. You're probably milling your own flour in that case, or you're privately contracting with a very, very small mill. Somehow, any commercially milled flour is going to be enriched. It's required.
Legally
required. It's legally required.
Right. So no, you can't get unenriched flour unless you get that flour from Europe or something.
I was going to say, yeah, you got a contract for that.
Yeah. Okay. The next question is, I understand that flour keeps aging through time. After how many days would you consider it becomes stable? That's an excellent question, Laura.
That's a really good question. I actually did some research on this a couple of years ago. And so there's an initial period of time after milling, so about 2 weeks or so after milling, when a lot of changes take place. So I would say it takes at least 2 weeks for the changes to slow down. It takes more like 2 to 3 months for the changes to kind of hit a plateau and kind of level out and stop for a while. So at least 2 weeks minimum aging time required. More like 2 to 3 months if you want to hit a place of stability where the flour isn't changing every single day.
So in an ideal world, you would have the flour train on rails shipped to you. It'll take about 2 weeks around there, and then have this perfect silo sitting out in this huge space that you have as a bakery to age it for 2 to 3 months. But we know that's not going to happen. So how do bakers take advantage of, how do they age flour naturally? What suggestions would you have?
Some of it, some of it depends on packaging. So obviously, the more oxygen permeable the packaging, the more aging can take place. So back in the day, you could use burlap bags. That's not exactly sanitary anymore, so it's not really realistic.
Please don't ask for burlap bags anymore.
No, and please don't dress your kids in them. No, really the only realistic way to do it is to use dough conditioners, to use the additives, and to get that oxidation taking place at a much faster rate, so you can use that flour that much quicker.
Right, great. Next question. What would be the most important specs for a frozen bread flour?
That's a really good question. So one of the critical aspects of frozen dough, of a flour for frozen dough applications, you really need to have nice, strong gluten properties so that it can withstand the freezing process and come out on the other side and still perform. So you're definitely looking at higher protein content, and you're looking at any test that will give you an indication of protein strength, whether that's Greenograph mixing stability or development time, or wet gluten content, SRC values, looking at the gluten performance index, anything that just shows you that the protein is strong.
So not just only a higher protein quantity, somewhere above 13 maybe?
Right.
You want it above 13, but also the quality, the absorption has to be higher, the peak has to be higher, and the MTI has to be higher.
Lower.
So, lower.
Yeah.
Yes, correct. Yeah. So those are the things that you need to look at in terms of finding a flour that's suitable for freezing. Not only that, you have to look into freeze-tolerant yeast as well. And we will cover those in the next live webinar Q&A. All right, next. What is a good MTI for bread flour?
That's a good question. It depends on the type of bread you're making. So you can have a higher MTI if you're using a gentler process. So maybe an MTI around 50 or so would be good. If you're using something that's more aggressive, you need a much lower MTI, maybe down around 20.
Right.
I would not go
like
much higher.
Pizza doughs,
right.
You can have a lower MTI.
Right.
Frozen dough, artisan bread, bagel, gotta have a high MTI. Right. Great. Why can't we have ash-free flour?
So even though we use ash as a stand-in for bran contamination, there's always going to be minerals in the endosperm, the starchy part of the kernel itself. So there's always going to be ash. Even if you had 0% bran in your flour, you'll have the minerals in the starchy endosperm, so there will always be ash.
So why can't the miller just take off everything and just give us the good white stuff?
So the centermost portion of the kernel where there's no risk of ash content is a patent flour, and that costs a lot of money because then the miller has to figure out what to do with all the other streams of flour that have the bran contamination in it, and they're typically going to get less value for that if they're selling it by themselves. So it's better for the miller to be able to mill everything into a straight grade where you blend all the streams together, even those that have a little bit higher ash, to come out with something around 0.5, 0.6% ash. It works better for the miller.
So you're telling me that I can get like 0.3% ash flour I just have to pay for it.
You have to pay for it.
Yeah. All right. And that's such a thing, right? I mean, I've seen Japanese flour.
I was gonna say, cake flours, especially those for Japanese cakes, will be very low in ash content.
What is it usually?
It's always below 0.4. You can start to push 0.3. I don't know.
0.3.
I don't think you're going to get lower than 0.3, but you can start to get close to it.
Right. All right. So if you have any more questions, just enter them in the Q&A. Just hover your cursor over the screen. In the center of the screen, there's a Q&A folder. So click on there and enter your questions. We're coming towards the end of our question queue, so we can afford to handle more questions. All right. Next questions. Next question is: sometimes we get a falling number closer to 150 than the target at 200. What should we do in that case?
Wow. It depends on the product that you're making. Certainly you can't use it for bread manufacturing. You're not going to be able to get the internal structure set
Can
up.
I just add in more gluten?
No.
That's
So
a typical question.
yeah. No, you can't add in more gluten because the final structure of bread is set by the starch. So if your starch is all broken down, adding more gluten is really not going to get you there.
So add more starch. I've got some wheat starch sitting around.
The other thing you have to consider is that at 150 seconds, you've liberated a lot of sugar from that starch that you've broken down, so you're going to get a lot of browning. So even if you add more starch in there and you can actually get the product to set up the way it's supposed to, you're going to have a lot of excess browning due to all of that excess sugar there. So I would hesitate to use it at 150.
So you're telling me that flour is trash?
Yeah.
So I can return it to the miller.
You can try.
I can try. All right, I'll try. So if you're having any problems with falling number and it become less than 200, keep an eye on the browning, keep an eye on water absorption, keep an eye on structural issues. Yeah. All right, Laura asks, when enriching flour, doesn't the oven destroy many of the added components, which I think means doesn't the oven destroy the enrichment?
Right. The enrichment. A lot of so certainly not the iron component. That's indestructible.
Iron's indestructible.
That's a really good question about the B vitamins, though, because a lot of that enrichment is on the B vitamin side. And so the question is typically how much water do you have in your product? And so the more water you have combined with heat, the more breakdown of those nutrients that you're going to see. So it kind of depends on the product and how much water you add and also the heat that you're using. You'll see some breakdown, but some of it will still get through in the finished product.
Yes, and that's really important in terms of enrichment. All right, next question. Brandon asks, what am I sacrificing by using a straight dough process for my frozen dough product rather than a sponge dough? Should I use more maturing additives? So this is like a twofold question. There are two things going on there. Well, firstly, it's very difficult to say how your dough is going to work without knowing whether it's an aged flour or green flour. Obviously, if you use a green flour, you're going to need maturing additives. Brandon, can you tell me what kind of flour you use? Do you use green flour that is milled within 24 hours or aged flour that's milled more than 2 weeks ago? So am I sacrificing by using straight dough for my frozen dough product or a sponge and dough? So most frozen manufacturers do not use the sponge and dough method, mainly because you want the yeast to be inactivated. And that's why many frozen dough manufacturers use the straight dough process and really a very low final temperature, dough mixing temperature. Unfortunately, that's not very friendly to the extensibility of the dough, and you're going to get a lot of tearing. And if you put the dough through a dough pump, if it's a more gentle, say like a stress-free Rayon system, then you don't need to worry about the tearing. So Straight dough, definitely for frozen dough product, not sponge and dough. And yes, unfortunately, if you use green flour, you have to have maturing additives, unless you have the luxury of aging your flour, which I don't think most bakeries have the luxury to do that, right? So I hope that answers your question. Next question. How do I allow my flour to mature without getting flour beetles, especially when it's hot?
That's really tough. I mean, honestly, the best way to do it is to use some kind of dough conditioner to speed up the maturation process. I mean, the best way to prevent flour beetles is with packaging and with temperature control. So a lot of times that means putting your product into refrigerated or low temperature storage, which slows down the maturation process. So I'm not exactly sure what the conditions are like there, and what the regulations are around additives in your flour, but I would suggest using dough conditioners and better packaging to keep the pest infestation to a minimum.
Right. I also once consulted on a bakery that had a beetle issue, and the eggs were pretty much everywhere. So it's a sanitation problem. So you need to make sure that you sanitize your plant properly. Make sure that all your shells are dust free. And also, where's the origin of the beetles? Are they coming from somewhere? Like, you need to seek out the origin. And pretty much, as long as your room, your storage room or storage facility is beetle free, you're not gonna have this as an issue. So really sanitize properly. Don't forget your air filters, and basically be really clean, and make sure you inspect every batch of flour coming in. Make sure there are no beetles in there to contaminate the rest of the batch.
Yeah.
You know, so there are ways to do this. Basically focus on clean and sanitation methods.
Yeah.
Okay. Next question. Is there a reason to add alpha amylase to a frozen bread dough if you're already adding sugar?
Yeah, I mean, we typically add amylase to just about any form of bread products that we make because you get such nice performance during baking. I mean, you need to you need to break down some of that starch in order to get proper loaf expansion during baking. So yes, the sugar that you add will feed the yeast and it will help with browning and whatnot, but you also need the amylase to help with the starch properties, especially during the baking process to get nice loaf volume.
So if you are a baker, dosing alpha amylase is going to be a challenge.
Yes.
And alpha amylase pretty much works, like Jayne said, works on the sugars. You don't need to add sugar for amylase to work. So I don't know why you would use alpha amylase in frozen dough, because isn't alpha amylase a shelf life extender?
Yeah. Yeah.
And frozen dough usually don't keep for very long after they're baked.
Yeah, it's more about getting the right alpha amylase in there. I mean, there are 3 different forms of amylase. There's a fungal source, there's the malted barley source, and then there's a microbial source. They're all suitable for different products, and so the key is identifying the right one for frozen dough. The shelf life extension comes more post-baking on the texture side of things. So it's more about keeping the texture soft after baking, in which case you probably want the malted barley flour.
Yep.
Or possibly microbial, but microbial is really hard to dose. It's easy to overdose a microbial amylase.
So what Dr. Jayne is recommending is if you are looking for a softer product after the dough is baked, then yes, use malted amylase.
Well, that's all we have for today. Check out our Academy page for more live stream in the future. And if you need a question answered privately, check out our new offering. Follow the link below to get Dr. Jayne Bock or I to answer your question. Before you go, please subscribe, like, and share this channel. Till the next time, bakers, quality problems? Check out your flour first.